January 10th, 1475. Frozen river valley in Eastern Europe is carpeted with the dead, Ottoman dead, tens of thousands of bodies strewn across the blood-stained snow for miles. The most powerful military machine on the planet has just lost half of its invasion force in a single afternoon. They came with 120,000 men, Janissaries who had conquered Constantinople, cavalry that had crushed the armies of the Balkans, artillery that had shattered fortress walls from Anatolia to the Danube. They outnumbered the defenders 3-1. By dusk, what remained of them was fleeing for its life. This is the Battle of Vaslui, one of the most catastrophic and decisive defeats in Ottoman history, and you have probably never heard of it, because the man who orchestrated this victory understood a fundamental truth most rulers never grasp. You cannot defeat an empire by being stronger. You defeat them by making conquest cost more than they are willing to pay, and Prince Stephen III of Moldavia was prepared to burn his own country to the ground to prove it. Before we begin, if you find value in content like this, history stripped down to the raw human decisions that shaped our world, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. It genuinely helps. Now, let us rewind 22 years to the day everything changed, May 29th, 1453. The walls of Constantinople, defenses that had stood for over a millennium, that had turned back Persians, Arabs, and barbarian hordes, fell in less than 2 months. The man who broke them was 21 years old, Sultan Mehmed II. He had inherited the Ottoman throne at 19, dismissed by rivals as too young, too reckless, too ambitious. His father's generals doubted him. European kings mocked him. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI believed God himself would protect the city. They were all catastrophically wrong. Mehmed brought something no besieger before him possessed: 70 cannons, including the monster known as Basilica, 27 feet long, firing half-ton stone balls that could punch through 12 feet of solid wall. He brought 80,000 troops, a navy he dragged overland to bypass chain barriers, and a cold, methodical patience that ground down every last defense. When the walls finally shattered and Ottoman soldiers poured into the streets, Constantine XI threw off his imperial regalia and died fighting in the chaos like a common soldier. His body was never found. Mehmed walked into the Hagia Sophia, the spiritual heart of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, for 900 years, and immediately ordered it converted into a mosque. He was standing in the building when he gave the command. No hesitation. The message was not subtle. This was not mere conquest. This was erasure. Christian Europe plunged into a state of profound shock. Constantinople was not just a city, it was the idea that Christendom had, an eternal shield in the East. That shield was now gone, and the Sultan who shattered it was only just beginning. Over the next 2 decades, Mehmed's armies moved like a tectonic force. Serbia fell in 6 years, Bosnia in 10. The last remnants of Byzantine Greece were absorbed. Wallachia, the land of Vlad the Impaler, was beaten into bloody submission and made a vassal state, its princes forced to pay tribute and kneel before Ottoman authority. By 1475, the Ottoman Empire controlled the entire Balkan Peninsula, Anatolia, and the Black Sea coast. They possessed the finest professional infantry in the world, cavalry that could shift from horse archers to shock troops in an instant, and a logistical system that could sustain armies hundreds of miles from home. They had not lost a major campaign in a generation, and now only one independent Christian principality remained between them and total dominion over the Black Sea. A small, rugged, forested land called Moldavia. Moldavia sat wedged between the Carpathian Mountains and the Dniester River. 400,000 people, mostly Orthodox Christian peasants and minor nobles, scattered across dense forests, deep river valleys, and rolling hills. It was not rich. It had no great cities or legendary castles, but it possessed something the Ottomans desperately needed: geography. Control Moldavia, and you control the northern Black Sea trade routes. You cut Poland off from the south. You encircle Hungary. You transform the Black Sea into an Ottoman lake, with no Christian power left to challenge you. It was the final piece of the strategic puzzle, and Mehmed II knew it. But Moldavia had survived on the knife's edge for a reason, not through strength, but through position. Surrounded by predators, Ottomans to the south, Crimean Tatars to the east, Poland to the north, Hungary to the west, each one powerful enough to crush Moldavia alone. So, Moldavia played them against each other, an alliance with Poland when the Ottomans pressed, tribute to the Tatars when Poland turned hostile, a careful, exhausting, and perpetual dance of survival that required flawless timing. One misstep, and Moldavia would vanish from the map, as Serbia had, as Bosnia had, as every other principality that believed it could negotiate with an empire. For 18 years, Moldavia had avoided that fatal mistake because the man ruling it understood something about empires that most princes did not. Empires do not respect strength, they respect cost. His name was Stephen III, and in 1474 he decided to make the cost of conquering Moldavia prohibitive. Stephen took power in 1457, the way most princes did in that brutal corner of the world, through violence. His predecessor was a usurper. Stephen needed an army to reclaim his throne, so he rode to Wallachia and made a deal with the one man in the region nobody wanted as an ally, Vlad Dracula, the Impaler. Vlad gave him troops. Stephen marched into Moldavia, defeated his rival's forces and executed him. Stephen was 24 years old, but where Vlad employed terror as state policy, forests of impaled enemies, raids designed to traumatize, Stephen chose a different path. He became a meticulous student of his enemy. He dissected every major Ottoman victory: Kosovo in 1389, Varna in 1444, Constantinople in 1453. He learned how the Janissary infantry fought, how the Sipahi cavalry maneuvered, how Ottoman artillery was deployed, how their long supply lines functioned. He then rebuilt the Moldavian army. The Curteni, professional soldiers loyal to him personally, became its hardened core. He drilled them incessantly in modern tactics and coordinated movements. He constructed fortresses at key strategic points, Suceava, Neams and others, not to hide behind, but to serve as anchors while his mobile forces struck. And he formed alliances, with Poland for northern security, with Hungary for western support, even, when necessity demanded, with the Crimean Tatars. He married his promises to whoever would believe them and broke them the moment they became a liability. This was not about honor, it was about survival. By 1474, Stephen had ruled for 17 years. He had fought Tatars, Hungarians, rival claimants, and countless Ottoman raiding parties. He had won most of those fights, not through superior numbers, but by dictating when and where the fight would happen. And he had reached one core conclusion. You cannot defeat the Ottoman Empire in an open battle on ground of their choosing. They have too many men, too much experience, too many resources, but you can make them bleed so profusely that they choose to leave you alone. In 1474, Stephen decided to test this theory to its absolute limit. He stopped paying the annual tribute to the Sublime Porte. Then he invaded Wallachia, defeated the Ottoman vassal prince there, and installed his own man on the throne. It was a calculated, direct, and unforgivable insult to Ottoman authority. Mehmed II received the news in Constantinople. The Sultan who had conquered the unconquerable city, who had never accepted defiance, who viewed resistance as an invitation for annihilation. His response was immediate and total, not a raid, not a punitive expedition, a campaign of complete conquest, and the man he sent to achieve it was a veteran who had stood beside him at the fall of Constantinople. Hardem Suleiman Pasha, governor of Rumelia, a commander with 2 decades of Balkan campaigns behind him, and he was coming with an army larger than anything Stephen had ever faced. The winter of 1474, the Ottoman army gathered in Bulgaria and Wallachia. Hardem Suleiman Pasha commanded a force estimated between 100,000 and 120,000 men. For context, this was one of the largest Ottoman armies ever sent into Europe during the 15th century, larger than the force that took Bosnia, larger than the army that crushed Serbia. This was not a punitive raid. This was extermination. The core was the Janissaries, boys taken from Christian families as children, converted to Islam, and trained from infancy to be elite, fanatically loyal infantry. They fought with matchlock muskets, composite bows and swords, moved in disciplined formations, and would die before retreating. They had been the first through the breaches at Constantinople. Flanking them were the Sipahis, the provincial cavalry, skilled horse archers who could fire accurately at a full gallop or charge home with lances like Western knights. They were paid through the timer system, land grants in exchange for military service. Their loyalty was to the Sultan and to the land they held. Then came the vassals. Wallachian troops under the Prince Stephen had deposed, Serbian auxiliaries, Bulgarian levies. These men had no love for the Ottomans, but their families lived in occupied territories, and disobedience meant death. And finally, the Akunchula, irregular light cavalry raiders. Their job was simple: ride ahead of the main army, burn everything, spread terror, break the enemy's will before the real battle even began. Suleiman Pasha's plan was straightforward: march north through Moldavia in 2 columns, devastate the countryside, force Stephen into an open battle where numbers would decide everything, then besiege the fortresses until Moldavia surrendered. But there was one critical detail that made this invasion different: the timing. Suleiman was invading in the dead of winter, deep snow, freezing temperatures, frozen rivers. Traditionally, armies did not campaign in winter. Too hard to supply, too brutal on the men and animals, too unpredictable. But Suleiman calculated that winter would catch Stephen unprepared. Poland could not send reinforcements through snow-choked mountain passes. Hungary would not risk its army in freezing conditions. Stephen would be isolated, unable to fully mobilize, forced to fight alone. It was a brilliant tactical gamble, except for one fatal problem. Stephen wanted to fight alone. Stephen could muster roughly 40,000 men, less than half of Suleiman's force. The core was the Curteni, the professionals he maintained and paid personally. They were his hammer. Then came the Vitezi, lesser nobles and their retainers who owed military service for their land. Competent, but their loyalty was to their estates first, their prince second. The largest group was the Rezeci, free peasants who owned their land and fought to keep it. They had no formal military training, but they knew every forest path, every river ford, every hidden valley, and they understood with absolute clarity what Ottoman conquest meant. Slavery, forced conversion, their children taken for the Janissary Corps. That understanding made them the most dangerous and motivated men in Stephen's army. Stephen had spent 17 years preparing for this exact moment. He had studied every Ottoman victory, every tactical manual, every strategic decision, and he had reached one irrevocable conclusion: never fight them on open ground where their cavalry can maneuver. Never let them choose the battlefield. Never give them the chance to leverage their numerical superiority. So, when his boyars, his noble commanders, gathered in December of 1474 and asked how they could possibly defend against 120,000 men, Stephen gave an order that made half of them question his sanity. Burn everything, not just the military stores, everything. Villages, crops, livestock, grain stores. Evacuate the population north, poison the wells, destroy anything the Ottomans could use for food, shelter, or guidance. One of his most trusted boyars, a man who had fought beside Stephen for a decade, stood up. "My prince, you are asking us to destroy our own country." Stephen did not blink. "I am asking you to choose between rebuilding and slavery. Suleiman brings 120,000 mouths to feed and tens of thousands of horses that need forage. They invade in winter because they believe we are not ready. So we make winter our greatest ally. We deny them food, shelter, and an easy target. We make every mile north cost them men, morale, and time. And if this does not work, then we were dead anyway." The room fell silent because everyone understood what Stephen was not saying. This strategy required Moldavian civilians to suffer immensely. Families would lose everything. Some would not survive the evacuation. Villages that had stood for generations would be reduced to ash. But the alternative was watching those same families marched south in chains. Stephen issued the orders that night. By the time Suleiman's vast army crossed the Danube in late December, Moldavia was already burning. The Ottomans were marching into a frozen, prepared graveyard. Late December 1474. The Ottoman army crossed the Danube and pushed north into Moldavian territory. The first day, morale was high. This was supposed to be quick. A repeat of Serbia, a repeat of Bosnia, a repeat of every other Balkan principality that had crumbled under Ottoman pressure. The soldiers expected resistance, then collapse, then plunder, warmth, and victory before spring. By the third day, they found the first village, empty, every building stripped bare, no food, no livestock, no people, just ashes where the grain stores had been. The well had something rotting at the bottom. Dead animals thrown in deliberately. The commanders sent scouts ahead. The reports were all the same. Village after village, all abandoned, all burned. No civilians, no supplies, nothing. Suleiman Pasha assumed Stephen was retreating in panic, destroying what he could not defend. A desperate, futile gesture. The Ottoman supply trains stretched all the way back to Wallachia. They had brought provisions. This was an inconvenience, not a crisis. Then the temperature plummeted. The winter of 1474-1475 was brutal, even by the standards of Eastern Europe. Deep snow, winds that cut through wool and leather, temperatures that blackened fingers and toes with frostbite, and the Ottomans were marching through it with no shelter, no hot food, and no idea where the enemy actually was. The Janissaries held their discipline. They always did, but the vassal contingents began to grumble. Wallachian troops, already unenthusiastic about invading fellow Orthodox Christians, suffered terribly. The Sipahai horses, bred in warmer climates, struggled in the deep snowdrifts. Men began falling sick. Still, Suleiman pushed north. They had come too far to turn back over mere discomfort. Then the raids began. Moldavian cavalry, light, fast, dressed for the winter, appeared out of the forests without warning. They would hit an Ottoman foraging party, kill a dozen men, and vanish before any organized response could form. Then they would appear 5 miles away an hour later, and do it again. The Ottomans tried to chase them. It was useless. The Moldavians knew every deer path, every frozen stream, every thicket where heavy cavalry could not follow. By the time Ottoman troops organized a pursuit, the raiders were gone. It was not just the casualties, it was the exhaustion. No one could sleep properly. Every shadow in the forest might be an ambush. Foraging parties now needed armed escorts, which slowed everything down. Scouts stopped returning. Suleiman's intelligence dried up. He knew Stephen's army was somewhere to the north, but where? How many? Were they preparing to defend a fortress or planning an ambush? He had no answers. By early January 1475, the Ottoman army had marched over 200 miles into Moldavia. They had not fought a single major engagement, but they were already bleeding, and they still had not seen Stephen's main force. 120,000 men need roughly 200 tons of food every day just to function. The horses, tens of thousands of them, need constant forage. In winter, in a country with nothing left to take, Suleiman's supply lines stretched back over 200 miles to Ottoman territory, through snow, through hostile terrain, through forests where Moldavian raiders ambushed supply wagons and disappeared. The rations grew smaller, then smaller again. Soldiers began slaughtering pack animals for meat, which meant less capacity to carry supplies, which meant even less food reaching the front lines. Men began dying not from battle, but from the cold, from hunger, from dysentery that spread through camps where sanitation had collapsed. The Wallachian vassals were the first to break discipline. Some deserted outright, risking execution because freezing to death in the wilderness seemed preferable. Others simply stopped following orders with any urgency. Why die for an empire that had conquered your homeland? Even the Janissaries, trained from childhood to endure anything, began to show cracks. Not in their battle readiness, but in their faces. Gaunt, exhausted, silent. And through it all, the Moldavian raids continued. A foraging party ambushed here. A baggage train burned there. Never a major battle, just constant grinding, soul-crushing attrition. Suleiman knew what was happening. His army was being bled to death without ever seeing the enemy. By the second week of January, he had reached the Vaslui region. Rolling hills, scattered forests, the frozen Balad River cutting through valleys, defensible terrain, but not impossible. And then, his scouts finally brought him the report he had been waiting for. Stephen's main army had been spotted, not retreating, not hiding in a fortress, deployed, in formation, ready to fight. Suleiman's officers urged caution. The army was weakened, undersupplied, demoralized. Perhaps they should consolidate, wait for spring, or pull back to establish a proper supply base. But Suleiman understood his situation better than they did. If he retreated without a victory, Mehmed II would have his head, literally. The Sultan did not tolerate failure, especially not from commanders who had promised an easy conquest. If he besieged a fortress like Suceava without supplies, his army would starve before the walls fell. If he kept marching north, more men would die every day from cold and hunger, and eventually the army would simply dissolve. He had one option left: force a decisive battle, crush Stephen's army with his remaining numerical superiority, end this nightmare before it killed them all. So, when Stephen offered him that battle near Vaslui, Suleiman took it. He did not realize that Stephen had spent 3 weeks engineering this exact moment, that every burned village, every poisoned well, every ambushed foraging party had been designed to bring the Ottoman army to this place, at this time, in this specific condition, exhausted, starving, desperate. January 10th, 1475. The fog. 2 armies faced each other across a frozen valley, and Stephen was about to show Suleiman Pasha what happens when you fight a war on someone else's land, by someone else's rules. The battlefield Stephen chose was a valley near the town of Vaslui, roughly 2 miles across, with forested heights on both flanks. The frozen, shallow Balad River cut through the middle at an angle. The ground was a series of rolling hills that looked open enough for cavalry, but were treacherously uneven. The Moldavians held the high ground on the northern end. Infantry positioned along the tree line. Artillery, only a few pieces, but placed where they could fire down slope into the valley. Cavalry hidden in the forests on both flanks, invisible from below. The Ottomans deployed on the lower ground in their standard formidable formation. Janissaries in the center, a solid block of professional infantry. Sipahi cavalry on the wings ready to sweep around and envelop. Vassal troops in reserve. Artillery positioned to support the advance. On paper, it was textbook. The same formation that had broken Hungarian armies at Varna, Serbian forces at Kosovo, Byzantine defences at Constantinople. But paper does not account for exhausted men, half-starved horses, and terrain that only looks favourable from a distance. Suleiman stood with his commanders studying the Moldavian positions. His officers saw what they expected to see: an outnumbered enemy, forced to make a final stand. The math was simple: 120,000 against 40,000, 3 to 1. Even weakened, those odds should be decisive. What they did not see was the ground itself. The valley floor was uneven, snowdrifts hid ditches, frozen stream crossings looked solid, but would crack under the weight of massed men. Scattered brush would break formation cohesion. The slopes were not steep, but they were steep enough that a cavalry charge uphill would lose all its momentum, and those forests on the flanks were not just trees, they were perfect cover for thousands of Moldavian cavalry. Stephen stood on the high ground, watching the Ottoman deployment with his senior commanders. One of his boyars, a man named Shendrea, looked at the vast Ottoman host filling the valley below. "We are outnumbered 3-1. Stephen did not take his eyes off the Ottomans. "They have marched 200 miles through winter, with no food and no rest. Look at their formations. See how slowly they move. See the gaps between their units. That is not an army. That is a mob, holding itself together through discipline alone, and if their discipline holds, then we must make them break it." Early morning. The temperature was far below freezing. Breath hung visible in the still air. Both armies waited. Then Suleiman gave the order. The Akunjala went first, the irregular light cavalry, meant to probe defences and draw out the enemy. They charged up the slope toward the Moldavian vanguard, screaming, firing arrows. The Moldavian infantry braced, pikemen in front, crossbowmen behind, a handful of arquebusiers, early handguns slow to reload, but devastating at close range. The Akunjala hit the Moldavian line and were thrown back immediately. Crossbow bolts tore through their light armour, arquebuses fired with thunderous cracks that spooked their horses. Pikes caught riders who pressed too close. The raiders pulled back, reformed, tried again, same result. They were not breaking through. Suleiman watched from his command position. The probe had failed, but it told him what he needed. The Moldavian vanguard was dug in, but not deep. Perhaps 5,000 men holding the forward position. Behind them, the main line. Hit them hard enough and they would fold. He gave the order for a general assault. Drums beat. The Janissaries began their advance. Disciplined, tight formations, moving up the slope in coordinated blocks. These were the men who had stormed Constantinople's walls under cannon fire and Greek fire. A Moldavian. Defensive line should not even slow them down. The Sipahi cavalry on the wings began their flanking maneuvers, curving around the sides of the valley to encircle the Moldavian position. The Moldavian vanguard commander, one of Stephen's most trusted officers, watched the Janissaries coming. Thousands of them. Professional. Relentless. His orders were clear. Hold as long as humanly possible. Then retreat. Make them think they are winning. The Janissaries closed to 100 yards, 50 yards. Moldavian crossbows and arquebuses opened fire. Men dropped, but the formation did not break. They kept coming. Contact. The sound was a metallic roar, screams, officers shouting orders in Turkish and Romanian filling the valley. The Moldavian vanguard fought with ferocious determination. Pikemen held the line. Swordsmen filled every gap. Wounded men kept fighting because retreating too early would ruin everything. For 20 minutes they held. Then the commander gave the signal. The Moldavian vanguard began a fighting retreat. Slowly, in control, pulling back toward the main line, making the Janissaries pay for every single yard, but retreating nonetheless. To the Ottoman commanders, it looked like the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Suleiman saw it too. Press them. Do not let them regroup. The Janissaries surged forward, and behind them, smelling victory, other Ottoman units followed. The vassal troops, the reserve contingents. Discipline began to fray at the edges, not collapsing, but loosening. Men pushed forward faster, eager to be part of the final decisive breakthrough. This was exactly what Stephen had planned for. Because the Moldavian vanguard was not retreating in panic, they were leading the Ottoman centre into the valley's throat. The Ottoman centre pushed deeper into the valley, chasing the retreating Moldavians. Janissaries first, then the supporting units, then, against standing orders, portions of the reserve. The momentum felt unstoppable. After 3 weeks of frozen misery, they were finally winning. Then, the ground betrayed them. What had looked like flat, snow-covered terrain from a distance was broken and uneven up close. The frozen stream crossings that seemed solid cracked under the weight of hundreds of armoured men. Snowdrifts hid ditches that twisted ankles and shattered formation lines. The Janissaries tried to maintain cohesion, but the valley compressed them. Units that had advanced in organised blocks now bunched together, shoulder to shoulder, unable to manoeuvre. The Moldavian artillery opened fire. Only a handful of guns, but positioned on the high ground with clear lines of sight down into the packed valley. Stone and iron balls tore through the compressed Ottoman formations. One shot could kill 5 men if they were packed tightly enough, and they were. The psychological effect was worse than the casualties, cannon fire in close quarters. The sound alone made men flinch, duck, break. Concentration! Officers shouted to hold formation, but you cannot hold formation when the man next to you simply disappears in a spray of red mist. Then the crossbows started. Moldavian archers, positioned in the forests on both flanks, concealed until this very moment, began loosing volleys into the exposed Ottoman flanks, not scattered shots, mass volleys, hundreds of bolts hitting exposed sides where there was no shield wall, no cover. The Sipahi cavalry on the wings, who were supposed to be executing flanking maneuvers, discovered they could not. The terrain that had looked passable from a distance was thick with trees, undergrowth, and deep snow. Horses could not charge through it. And the moment they slowed, Moldavian archers hidden in the woods cut them down. Suleiman, watching from his command position, realized what was happening. This was not a battle. It was an ambush on a monumental scale. He shouted orders to halt the advance, to consolidate, to pull back to defensible positions. His officers relayed the commands. Some units heard and tried to comply. Others, already committed and under withering fire, could not disengage. The Ottoman army, 120,000 strong on paper, was fragmenting in real time. And Stephen, watching from the high ground, saw the exact moment he had been waiting for. The Ottoman center was disordered. The flanks were pinned. Morale was cracking. He turned to his cavalry commanders. Now! The Moldavian heavy cavalry burst from the flanking forests on both sides simultaneously. Boyar lancers, armored, mounted on war horses bred for shock impact, hit the exposed Ottoman flanks like a collapsing wall. This was not a wild charge into prepared infantry. Stephen had timed it perfectly. Strike the units already disrupted, already under fire, already struggling to maintain any cohesion. The impact was catastrophic. Ottoman soldiers, compressed in the valley and unable to form defensive squares, were ridden down before they could react. Lances punched through armor, horses trampled men who tried to stand. The Moldavian cavalry was not trying to break through, they were trying to shatter, and they succeeded. The Ottoman left flank folded first. The Wallachian vassal troops, already demoralized and fighting people they had no desire to kill, broke ranks and ran. No dramatic last stands. They simply ran. That opened a gaping hole in the Ottoman line. Moldavian infantry poured through the breach, hitting the exposed rear of the Janissary formations that were still trying to advance up the center. Now the Janissaries were being attacked from the front and the rear simultaneously. They tried to pivot, to form defensive circles to hold their ground. And to their eternal credit, they fought. The Janissaries were professionals. They did not panic easily. But professionalism does not stop arrows. It does not stop cavalry charges from multiple directions. It does not stop exhaustion and hunger from overwhelming you when you are fighting for your life. One by one, Janissary units were isolated, surrounded, and overwhelmed. The Sipahi cavalry on the right flank, seeing the total collapse on the left, tried to break off their stalled flanking maneuver and return to support the center. But disengaging from combat is far harder than starting it. Moldavian light cavalry harassed them the entire way. By the time they fought their way back to the center, the battle was already over. Suleiman Pasha, from his command position, watched his army disintegrate. Officers shouted contradictory orders. Units retreated without permission. The center was collapsing. The flanks were gone. And the Moldavians were not stopping. They pressed the attack relentlessly, giving no time to regroup, no moment to breathe. He made the decision every commander dreads. Save what you can. He ordered a full retreat, but a retreat requires coordination. It requires discipline. It requires soldiers who still believe their officers can get them out alive. The Ottoman army had none of those things left. The retreat became a rout. When an army breaks, it does not happen all at once. It starts with individuals. One man throws down his weapon and runs, then a dozen, then 100, then entire units. The Ottoman soldiers ran south, back the way they had come, into the frozen wilderness they had barely survived marching through. No formation, no officers, just pure, primal survival instinct. Stephen's order was clear. Pursue them until they stopped running. Moldavian cavalry hunted the fleeing Ottomans through the forests and snow, not for glory, not for honor, for necessity, because Stephen understood what most princes did not. Mercy today is another invasion tomorrow. Every Ottoman soldier who made it home was a soldier who could return with reinforcements. Every officer who survived would learn from this defeat and fight smarter next time. So, there was to be no mercy. Moldavian horsemen ran down fleeing Ottomans for miles. Some Ottoman soldiers tried to surrender, shouting in Turkish, dropping to their knees. A few high-ranking officers, men worth a ransom, were taken prisoner. The rest were cut down. Some Ottomans tried to fight back, forming small, desperate defensive groups in the forests. They were surrounded and killed. Others tried to hide, burrowing into snowdrifts or climbing trees. Moldavian infantry found them. The pursuit continued long into the night. Torches flickered in the darkness. Screams echoed in multiple languages. The sound of horses and steel, and men begging for their lives in words no one bothered to translate. By dawn on January 11th, The valley near Vaslui was a frozen graveyard. Bodies were everywhere, mostly Ottoman, but Moldavian as well. This had not been a bloodless victory. Blood had turned the snow into red slush that refroze overnight. Men who could not move froze to death where they lay. Scavengers, human and animal, were already picking through the dead. The count, as best as anyone could manage in the aftermath, was staggering. Between 40,000 and 45,000 Ottoman dead, perhaps more. Some bodies were never found, lost in the forests or buried under snowdrifts. For context, that is roughly 40% of the entire invasion force gone in a single day. Moldavian casualties were estimated between 4,000 and 8,000. Significant, painful, but survivable. The Janissary Corps, the elite corps of Ottoman military power, had been gutted. The vassal contingents were shattered. The Sipahi cavalry had lost thousands. Ottoman artillery, baggage trains, supplies, all captured. Hatem Suleiman Pasha survived. He managed to rally a few thousand men and began the long, nightmarish retreat back to Ottoman territory. Moldavian and allied Tatar forces harassed them every step of the way. Starvation, cold, and ambushes killed hundreds more. By the time Suleiman crossed back into Ottoman-controlled Wallachia, he had less than half the army he had started with. He had been sent to conquer Moldavia in a single, swift campaign. He returned with the worst Ottoman defeat in a generation, and Stephen III of Moldavia, outnumbered 3-1, had just done what everyone said was impossible. He had beaten the empire that could not be beaten. Pause for a moment. Imagine you are one of Stephen's boyars in December of 1474. The Ottomans are coming with 3 times your numbers. The empire that took Constantinople, that crushed Serbia and Bosnia and Wallachia. Your prince tells you the plan. Burn your own villages, poison your own wells, make your people refugees in the dead of winter. Then lure the enemy into a valley and hope that hunger and cold have weakened them enough that 40,000 men can beat 120,000. If it works, you are a genius. If it fails, your country disappears from history and everyone you know ends up in chains. Would you have made that call? Could you have ordered your own people to suffer on the chance it might save them later? Let me know in the comments. I am genuinely curious what you would do. And if you are still here, if this story resonates differently than the usual history content, subscribe, because we are not done yet. Stephen just won the battle, but the war, that is about to get much, much worse. News of Vaslui spread through Christian Europe like a shockwave. Messengers rode west to Hungary, to Poland, to the Italian states. Within weeks, the story reached Rome, Venice, Vienna. A small, obscure principality, barely a footnote in European politics, had just destroyed an Ottoman army 3 times its size. Not defeated, destroyed. Pope Sixtus IV received the report in February. He read it twice, certain there had been a mistake in translation. When his advisers confirmed the details, he declared Stephen III Athleta Christi, the champion of Christ, and called for prayers of thanksgiving across Catholic Europe. This was not mere propaganda. It was desperation finding a sudden, brilliant point of hope. Constantinople had fallen 22 years earlier. That wound was still raw, still bleeding. The Ottoman advance had seemed inevitable, methodical, unstoppable. Every Christian kingdom that stood against them had been crushed or vassalized. The psychological weight of that was breaking European morale. Vaslui changed the equation. If Moldavia could beat them, perhaps they were not invincible after all. Perhaps the tide could be turned. Letters poured into Stephen's court from across the continent. Venice offered trade deals. Hungary proposed a formal alliance. Poland, already technically an ally, suddenly became far more interested in honoring its commitments. The Papal States sent money and encouragement. Stephen transformed almost overnight from a borderland warlord into a continental hero. Chronicles written in Latin, Italian, and German praised him as the defender of Christendom. Artists depicted him as a warrior saint. Poets compared him to Alexander and Caesar. He was 42 years old, and he had just achieved what every Christian prince had been trying to do for decades: prove the Ottomans could bleed. But while Europe celebrated, Stephen stood in the ruins of his own country and did the math. Vaslui had cost him thousands of his best soldiers. The Scorched Earth campaign had destroyed 1/3 of Moldavia's villages. Thousands of civilians had died during the evacuation from cold, starvation, disease. The ones who survived had nothing to return to. And Mehmed II, the Sultan who had conquered Constantinople, who had never tolerated defiance, who viewed defeat as a personal insult, was still very much alive. Stephen knew exactly what was coming next. Not a punitive raid, not another 120,000-man expedition. Total annihilation. In the summer of 1476, 15 months after Vaslui, Mehmed assembled an army in Thrace. Not under a subordinate this time. He would lead it personally. The humiliation of Vaslui was not just a military setback, it was an existential threat to Ottoman prestige. Mehmed had built his entire reputation on conquest. He had taken Constantinople at 21. He had crushed every rebellion, defeated every rival, expanded the empire further than any sultan before him. And now, a prince from a backward principality had killed 45,000 of his soldiers and made him look weak. Every vassal state was watching. Every rival within the empire was whispering. If Moldavia could defy the Ottomans and survive, why could not others? Mehmed's response was to assemble the largest Ottoman army sent into Europe in the 15th century. Estimates range from 150,000 to 200,000 men. Janissaries, Sipahis, vassal troops, conscripts from Anatolia, massive artillery trains, engineers, everything. His objective was not mere occupation, it was erasure. The orders were explicit: burn every village, kill every armed man, enslave the population, salt the earth, make Moldavia a lesson no one would ever forget. Stephen, watching from Moldavia, knew he could not win this fight the same way. Vaslui had worked because Suleiman's army arrived exhausted and starving. But Mehmed was coming in summer, not winter. He had more men, more supplies, and he would not make the same mistakes. So Stephen adjusted. He evacuated the population again, this time to fortified cities and across the border into Poland. He burned what was left to burn, and instead of offering a single decisive battle, he waged a war of pure guerrilla attrition. Hit supply lines, ambush scouting parties, burn bridges, poison wells, retreat before superior forces. Never ever let Mehmed pin down the main Moldavian army. It was a strategy of brilliant, desperate resilience, and it was not enough. Mehmed's army swept through southern Moldavia like a flood of fire and steel. Every village they found, even the ones already destroyed in 1475, they obliterated completely. Stone foundations were torn apart. Wells were filled with rubble and corpses. Forests were set ablaze. Thousands of Moldavians who had not evacuated in time were captured. Some were killed on the spot. Others were chained and marched south to the slave markets of the Ottoman Empire. By late July, Mehmed reached Suceava, Moldavia's strongest fortress, Stephen's capital, and he laid siege. Suceava's walls were thick stone, built on high ground, reinforced over decades. Inside were supplies, weapons, and a garrison commanded by officers who had fought at Vaslui. They knew exactly what Ottoman conquest looked like. They were not opening the gates. Mehmed positioned his artillery and began the bombardment. For 3 weeks, Ottoman cannons hammered the walls. Stone cracked. Sections collapsed. Assault teams tried to storm the breaches and were thrown back with heavy casualties. The Janissaries tried again. Same result. The garrison was not just defending. They were making Mehmed pay in blood for every single attempt. Meanwhile, Stephen was outside the siege lines with the main Moldavian army, refusing to commit to a relief battle he knew he would lose. Instead, he did what he had done all summer. He bled the Ottomans through relentless attrition. Moldavian cavalry raided Ottoman supply lines constantly. Baggage trains were ambushed. Foraging parties were cut down. Wells were poisoned before the Ottomans could reach them. Mehmed had brought massive supplies, but feeding 150,000 men for weeks while besieging a fortress that refused to fall was draining his resources at an alarming rate. Worse, disease began spreading through the Ottoman camp. Dysentery, typhus, the ancient, inevitable killers of siege warfare. And the longer Mehmed remained bogged down in Moldavia, the more other problems surfaced. Reports from Anatolia, unrest among rival factions who saw the Sultan distracted and vulnerable. Reports from Wallachia, the vassal prince was making independent moves, testing the limits of Ottoman authority. Reports from his own camp. Morale was collapsing among troops who had been promised a quick, glorious campaign and were now dying of disease in front of walls they could not break. By mid-August, Mehmed faced the same calculation Suleiman Pasha had faced 15 months earlier. He could stay and watch his army disintegrate, or he could leave without achieving his objective. The difference was, Mehmed had a reputation that could survive a strategic withdrawal if he framed it correctly. He gave the order: lift the siege, march south. But before leaving, he turned southern Moldavia into a permanent wasteland. Every structure still standing was destroyed. Every field was salted. Every well was filled. The message was brutal and clear. You did not win. You simply survived. Stephen, watching the Ottoman army retreat, knew Mehmed was right. Suceava still stood. Moldavia was still independent, but half of his country was gone, not occupied, erased. The villages burned in 1475 had been destroyed again in 1476. The survivors from the first invasion were now refugees from the second. This was victory. Yes, because Moldavia still existed, and in the face of the Ottoman Empire, that fact alone mattered more than anything else. Stephen rebuilt. That is what rulers do after wars. They rebuild. Villages were reconstructed, though many would never be repopulated. Fields were replanted, though entire regions would remain empty for years. Refugees returned to find nothing left of the homes they had abandoned, not once, but twice. The chronicles record Stephen's victories. They list the battles, the casualty figures, the strategic importance. 47 years on the throne, over 40 battles fought, only 2 defeats. What the chronicles do not record are the names of the peasant family who evacuated in December of 1474, lost their youngest child to the cold, returned in the spring of 1475 to rebuild, only to burn everything again in 1476 and never come back. Or the Moldavian soldier who survived Vaslui, but lost an arm to infection and spent the rest of his life begging because he could no longer hold a plough. Or the Janissary, taken from a Christian village as a boy, converted, trained, and sent to die fighting Christians at Vaslui, whose original family never knew what happened to him. Or the Wallachian vassal who fled during the battle, made it home, and was executed by Ottoman authorities for cowardice. His crime was refusing to die for an empire that had conquered his homeland. The strategic logic of Vaslui was brilliant. Scorched earth denied the enemy resources, terrain negated their numbers, timing exploited their exhaustion. But strategy is clean. The human cost is chaos. Every military victory in history is built upon a foundation of individual tragedies that no one ever bothers to count. The mother who evacuated with 3 children and arrived with 2. The farmer who watched his land burn twice and decided survival was not worth the price. The soldier who did everything right and still died screaming in the snow. Stephen understood this better than most. He made the call knowing precisely what it would cost. And he made it anyway, because the alternative was unthinkably worse. That is not heroism. That is simply leadership. In a world where all your options are terrible, and you must choose the one that allows your people to live another day. Moldavia survived. That was the point. That was always the point. But survival came at a price that does not show up in chronicles or victory celebrations. It showed up in empty villages, in the faces of people who had lost everything, twice, in the silence of families who would never be whole again. And Stephen, champion of Christ, defender of Moldavia, the prince who beat the Ottomans, carried that weight for the next 28 years. Because the war did not end in 1476. It never really ended. Vaslui did not stop the Ottoman Empire. That needs to be stated clearly because the story often gets mythologized. One battle, even a catastrophic defeat, does not break an empire that spans 3 continents. The Ottomans came back in 1476, and they came back stronger. They would return again in 1484 and seize key Moldavian fortresses on the Black Sea coast. They would conquer Hungary 50 years later. They would besiege Vienna twice. The Ottoman Empire would not begin its long decline for centuries. So, what did the Battle of Vaslui actually accomplish? Time. It bought years. Precious years where Hungary, Poland, and Moldavia itself could prepare their defenses, form stronger alliances, and build the military infrastructure necessary for longer-term resistance. In geopolitics, time is not an abstract concept. It is the difference between facing an invasion when you are ready and facing it when you are not. Vaslui also exposed Ottoman vulnerabilities in a way other European commanders could study and later exploit. Overextended supply lines in hostile territory, the unreliability of vassal troops under pressure, the fact that numerical superiority means nothing on restrictive terrain, the psychological impact of winter, hunger, and constant harassment. These were not secrets before Vaslui, but Stephen III proved they could be weaponized into a decisive victory. Hungarian commanders studied this battle when preparing for their own wars against the Ottomans. Polish strategists analyzed its lessons. Even Austrian generals a century later, during the Great Siege of Vienna in 1683, would reference its core principles: control the logistics, choose your ground, force the enemy to fight on your terms, not theirs. Vaslui became a template, but its deepest impact was psychological. For 22 years after the fall of Constantinople, Christian Europe had operated under a crushing assumption of inevitability. Ottoman conquest was a force of nature. You could delay it, you could negotiate with it, you could buy time, but you could not stop it. Vaslui shattered that assumption, not permanently, not decisively, but enough to prove that the Ottomans were not invincible, that brilliant generalship and sheer force of will could overcome overwhelming numerical superiority. That resistance was not futile. That belief, fragile as it was, kept Moldavia independent for another generation. It stiffened Hungarian resolve. It gave Polish kings crucial leverage in their negotiations. Stephen did not save all of Europe. He bought it a chance, a crucial window of time, to save itself. And sometimes, in the face of an empire, that is all you can do. Stephen III ruled Moldavia until 1504, 47 years in total. He was 71 when he died, ancient by medieval standards, especially for a man who had spent his entire adult life at war. The battles did not stop after Vaslui. He fought the Ottomans again in 1485, 1486, 1487. He fought the Poles in 1497 when they invaded over a territorial dispute and defeated them too at the Battle of the Kosmin Forest. He fought Hungarian incursions. He fought Tatar raids that never ceased. He fought rival claimants to his throne. Over 40 battles in 47 years. He lost 2. That record is not luck. It is the product of obsessive preparation, ruthless pragmatism, and the profound understanding that survival is not a one-time event. It is a state of constant, unyielding vigilance. He never stopped building fortresses. He never stopped drilling his troops. He never stopped cultivating alliances that he would dissolve the moment they became a liability. By the time he was buried at the Putna Monastery, a church he had founded, the chronicles called him the greatest prince Moldavia ever had, not because he was merciful or particularly beloved, but because he had kept his people free. 5 centuries later, in 1992, the Romanian Orthodox Church canonized him, Saint Stephen the Great, defender of the faith, protector of Christian Europe. Modern Romania claims him as a foundational figure of national identity. His image is on currency, in textbooks, on monuments. January 10th, the anniversary of Vaslui, is commemorated. But here is where memory becomes complicated. The Republic of Moldova, independent since 1991, also claims Stephen as its national hero. He is on their currency too. His fortresses are Moldovan heritage sites. His legacy is taught as Moldovan history. Romanians argue he was a proto-Romanian. Moldovans argue he founded Moldovan statehood. Historical figures often become battlegrounds for modern identity politics. Everyone wants to claim the heroes. What is undeniable, regardless of modern borders, is this. Stephen understood something most rulers throughout history have failed to grasp. Empires do not respect strength. They respect cost. Make conquest expensive enough, painful enough, bloody enough, and even the strongest empire will eventually look elsewhere for easier prizes. That is what the Battle of Vaslui proved. Not that a small nation can destroy an empire, but that it can make an empire pay such a high price in blood and treasure that the prize ceases to be worth the cost. And sometimes, that is the only victory available. January the 10th, 1475. A frozen valley in Eastern Europe. 40,000 Moldavians facing 120,000 Ottomans. The empire that had conquered Constantinople, crushed the Balkans, and terrified all of Christendom for decades, decisively defeated, not by superior numbers, not by divine intervention, but by a prince who understood that wars are won before the first sword is ever drawn. Stephen did not outfight the Ottomans at Vaslui. He outthought them. He turned their greatest strengths into fatal vulnerabilities. Their immense size became a logistical nightmare. Their vast experience bred arrogance. Their overwhelming momentum led to fatal overextension, and when they finally reached the battlefield, exhausted, starving, and desperate, he destroyed them. But here is the part that matters most. Stephen knew this victory would not last forever. He knew Mehmed would return. He knew the Ottomans had more soldiers, more resources, more of everything. He knew one battle, even a catastrophic Ottoman defeat, would not change the fundamental imbalance of power. So why fight? Because survival is not about winning forever. It is about lasting long enough that your enemy recalculates. It is about making them look at the cost and decide you are not worth it. That is what Vaslui accomplished. It did not save all of Europe. It did not end the Ottoman threat. It just made the Sultan and his court reconsider whether Moldavia was worth another 45,000 dead. And that reconsideration bought time, years, decades. Enough for Moldavia to remain independent for another generation. Enough for neighboring kingdoms to prepare. Enough for the psychological grip of Ottoman invincibility to weaken. Just a little. Most medieval battles are footnotes, studied only by specialists. Vaslui is still analysed 5 centuries later because it proved something that remains eternally relevant. Empires can be resisted. Numbers do not guarantee victory. Terrain, strategy, and will can overcome overwhelming odds. And sometimes, the greatest act of leadership is choosing the terrible option that keeps your people free instead of the comfortable option that leads to their enslavement. Stephen III died in 1504 at the age of 71 after 47 years of constant warfare. His country had been burned, rebuilt, burned again, and rebuilt once more. His people had suffered losses no chronicle could ever fully capture, but Moldavia was still there, independent. And that, in the end, was the entire point. If this story resonated with you, if you made it this far and are still thinking about frozen valleys and impossible decisions, please share this video, not for the algorithm, but because there are people who need to hear that resistance is not always futile. That being small does not mean being powerless. That brilliant strategy and absolute commitment can overcome the most overwhelming odds. Subscribe if you want more content like this. Real history, without the sugarcoating. Just the decisions that shaped our world and the people who paid the price for them. And leave a comment below. Tell me what you think. What would you have done in Stephen's position? Would you have burned your own country to save it? I read every comment. And honestly, this is the kind of history worth discussing, worth remembering. Thank you for watching.